Hello there, everyone. Um, I just had to agree to the recording. So that's right. Well, welcome. I'm going to take on a rather whirlwind tour from the last 50 years, picking out some of the highlights that I've had a personal experience with, and looking at how thinking has changed about food security over that time, and how the dynamics in the food system have been shaping, both from a local to a global perspective. So I hope I don't give you indigestion in this rather large taster menu, but I'm now going to share a screen and we're going to kick off. Um, can you all see the screen, folks? Just somebody to yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Now, 50 years ago, I was excited to be going to Rothamsted Experimental Station as part of my soil science degree in the summer of '71, the world's oldest agricultural research institution. But as I did more and more in my soil science degree, I realised there's a thing we left out, which was people, because it's people that decide how we manage our food systems, what we do, and the institutions humans create. So I ended up then doing some more studying on history and social studies of science and how they are used in shaping what goes on in the world, both at Sussex and in the USA, and ended up with my first job for a big publishing company, the specialist arm, and ended up developing a new journal on food policy, more of which in a minute. But that was me. There were big things happening in the 70s. At that time, over 460 million people were undernourished, and that excluded China and the other centrally planned economies, so the numbers was much higher. There'd been famines in the early 70s and big price rises linked to changes in policy of the US in selling grain to the Russians. OPEC raised the price of oil fourfold. The Limits to Growth report came out from the Club of Rome looking 40 to 50 years ahead. And there were big environment conference in 72, the Stockholm Environment Conference, a population conference in 74, and a UN food conference in 1974. And that was the first of the big conferences post-war. At that conference, the grand claim was made that they wanted to ensure every man, woman, and child has the inalienable right to be free from hunger and malnutrition in order to develop their physical and mental faculties. And at that time, food security was defined as being the availability at all times of adequate world food supplies of basic foodstuffs to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption and to offset fluctuations in production and prices. And by that, they meant things to do like grains, the kind of major grain traded commodities, and also were interested in having some controls how the commodity system worked. A year later, we launched the Food Policy Journal, and a lot of the issues we talked about then, we're still talking about today. We talked about urban bias and the role of nutrition and development, energy and food production, and even had a report on long-term climate fluctuations. And in that first issue, Tim Josling outlined the kind of two main ways people thought about how we dealt with our food system challenges, one of which focused on production and simply said we've got to produce more food, and if we've got enough food and producing enough, everyone will be fine. I caricature. And the other one looked at distribution and saying, actually, no, we have to look at the mechanisms by which food gets to people and so on. And he commented that food issues are in fact becoming more closely related to general economic and social concerns in most countries of the world. It is the vital but elusive ingredient of political will that sets the pace for a resolution of these issues. And that political will issue continues to be with us today, as we saw at the COP26 summit. So what is food policy? Well, the OECD, the Rich World's Club, talked about food policies being about influences on the set of relationships and activities. And it's these things that interact to determine what, how much, by what method and for whom food is produced, distributed, and I'd add consumed. But there was a real problem that was developing. Whilst a lot of the focus in the developing world was on underconsumption, in the rich world, the key problem, as the OECD identified, was that you had consumers who the market was saturated for the kind of diets people had. There was limited demand for food. We only need so much. Having too much is a bad thing. And there was an overproduction of major commodities. And it was this mix of things that drove innovation for those actors involved in the food system. It increased the pressures for competition between them, to look for new technologies to give them an edge in the market, to increase the productivity of the land, the labour, and the capital that they used in the businesses, and also to diversify out from core businesses into a wider field. And there were three key trends at that time that have really grown and developed since that the OECD identified. One of which is the economic concentration of power in each sector of the marketplace, producing kind of a playing field where elephants play in oligopolistic forms of competition, as they say. Also, a move to global markets and serving global markets, which developed apace after the fall of the Soviet Union and the embracing of kind of capitalism in a way by these Chinese. And the other key trend was for looking for ever better mechanisms of control for the different actors to use throughout the system. A trend they didn't identify then, but has happened since, is a huge geopolitical shift. As power has moved from the West and the North, from Europe and North America, to the South and the East, which is a historic shift after 500 years of domination of the global structures by European and European derived powers, which is going to play out in unforeseen ways this century. So what do you want a food system to do? Well, I would argue that what we want a food system to do is provide safe and secure and sustainable, sufficient and nutritious diets, and there can be all kinds of diets, for all, equitably. And what is a food system about? Well, when I worked on this book with Tony Worsley, it struck me there are four key words to remember when looking at change, and that is who has what power to control their bit of the action in this system, who carries the risks from what's happening, and who gets the benefits. And there are three basics that all the actors in the food system have to deal with. Really, it's a biological system. We need a healthy environment and ecology in order for food to be able to continue to be produced for the next 1,000, 10,000 years, as long as humans are around. And we know that human societies have frequently got their relationship with the environment wrong. This is a picture from the 30s of the Dust Bowl in America, linked to inappropriate farming methods, linked to then droughts, and you find some of these images now happening in China. The second element is that it's got a history. If I asked you all, which I would if we were in person, what you had for breakfast today, and then I asked you to think about what someone might have had for breakfast 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago in Leeds, on the Leeds area, you would realise that it was very different. Because what we eat has got a history, and it is linked to a whole global restructuring of the food system, which most recently, by which I mean the last 500 years, has been linked to European colonial expansion. And if you're interested in this area, there's a very interesting interview with James Wolvin on the blog I do, and an excellent book by Lizzie Collingham on Hungry Empire and how Britain's quest for food shaped the modern world. So what we look at today has got a history, and it could all be different. The other thing, of course, is that food does meet a certain basic need, but our human needs are multidimensional, and food isn't just about energy for the body. Nobody, and you wouldn't have said to me, I had for breakfast a load of carbohydrate and some protein. You'd have talked about foods. We eat physiological need, psychological, we use them to please ourselves and to reward us, social and cultural. Food's embedded into every culture with all kinds of social and cultural norms associated with what you do and don't eat. It's really central to how societies operate. Now, within the food system, there's a whole set of actors, and this is really a very broad brush sketch, but we have the people who supply the inputs to farmers. Modern farmers use all kinds of inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, energy, machinery, veterinary services, and medicines, and so on. And there are all kinds of different farmers. There are traders. These are the people who move products around the world in large quantities, and they could be tin products, or they could be the grain traders, of which there are now very few, just 4 control most of the grain moving around the world today. There are the workers throughout the food system, generally less well organized and less well paid than workers in industries. and there are a lot of them. Biggest sector really, if you add in everybody from who works on a farm, the input supplies, right through to the hospitality and catering industries and retail. There are processors and manufacturers who turn what farmers produce as raw materials into foods that we eat, whether that's wheat into bread or what have you. And the other area, of course, is the wholesalers and retailers. And in the UK and most of the rich world, we've seen a great reduction in the number of wholesalers and small shops, and a great increase in the multiple retailers, the big players in the game. And there are caterers. Caterers who you might see at a station, apparently all having a different name, but all belonging to the same company. And caterers are those who serve you as retail customers, and also those who support and fund and provide food in hospitals and industry and universities. There are finally, of course, consumers and citizens. Um, I much prefer us to talk about citizens, and the Food Ethics Council's got to work on food citizenship. Because if you talk about someone as a consumer, you're really narrowing down what you mean and what the people are about, because that's about what is your choice that you have in the market, which is related to the power you have in the person. And finally, of course, there are governments, policymakers, and lobbyists, and they set the framework in which these different actors operate. And that is a kind of very brief overview of how we might think of people in the food system. It isn't some kind of mechanical system, it's got a lot of interests and concerns in it. And if you look at these couple of diagrams, they show you, in fact, how, in fact, over the last 50, 100 years, just very few people control the food that moves into consumption. And the buying desks, 5 in Holland, I think it's only 2 in Canada, it's 5 or 6 in the UK. This has really shifted the power balance from the manufacturers and others into the retail sector. So what kind of things do people use as tools for control in this system? Well, obviously, historically, it's been political, military and economic power. That is what has shaped today's system. Other areas are, of course, are science and technology. But we often use them interchangeably, but you don't actually need to have a correct scientific understanding of something to develop a technology that works, and the history of canning is a good example of this. But sometimes you need a breakthrough in science to even conceive of a technology. That's what Einstein led to when he showed that you could convert matter into energy and make a heck of a big bang in a new way. And what Watson and Crick have led the way in when they discovered that DNA is a sequence and it has a set of letters that you can manipulate, and behind which has developed this whole development of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and so on. Other area used for control is information. Some of it is to shape people's interests and concerns, information and marketing, other of which you keep to yourself so that you can get an edge in the market if you can corner an orange juice market or what have you. There's just some great films about that, like Trading Places. Another area is management and how you manage the business that you've got. And in the UK, the supermarkets in the 90s spent a lot of money, hundreds of millions of pounds, on the logistics to shape a system that suited their needs, not necessarily the one that was the most environmentally appropriate, but it actually suited them and their operations. And finally, of course, there's the area of the laws and the rules and the regulations. And these have moved from being increasingly national to regional to global. I'll say a lot more about these because I think they're an area that we neglect, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But if you actually look, say, on the information side and what goes to trying to shape people's aspirations, you'll find that what's advertised, and this a little bit old now, but it gives you the point. What's advertised is the opposite of what people would recommend as a healthy diet. So you get most of the fatty and sugary foods advertised, the antithesis of the bread, cereals, potatoes, etc. And there's an excellent report I strongly recommend from the Food Foundation called Force Fed that looks at an average British family, not the poorest, not the richest, and the things that go on to shape aspirations. You can see there they're advertising 3% spent on fruit and veg, 58% on confectionery. And really interesting and useful report if you're interested in this area. Writ large and globally, just one food and drink company, Coke, spent 4 billion in 2016 on advertising and marketing. Now compare that with the entire total expenditure of the World Health Organization for 2 years at 4.4 billion. And we have to remember too that marketing is not just about adverts, it's about sponsorship, texting, whispering, product placement, etc., and the massive use now of social media. All of this in the last 50 to 60 years has changed who eats. You've got to get people who are already in a saturated market to eat more. One of the things that's happened, if you've seen the amounts and the portion sizes have increased, you've seen it in soft drinks going from a little bottle into bigger and bigger paper cups. And you've seen it in the increase in the energy density of foods and turning grain into meat, a cheap product into an expensive product. And you've seen new markets being sought and created for food and feedstuff, feeding soya to cattle, expanding milk consumption to China, a lactose intolerant country by and large, and taking bread into countries that never consumed wheat. So you've seen this huge change globally in who eats what. And that was all been happening in those intervening years. And in 1992, there was the first International Conference on Nutrition, recognizing that all the aspirations that had been spouted in 1974 hadn't really been met, and that they wanted to talk about eliminating famine and famine-related deaths and reducing starvation by 2000, and diet-related communicable diseases. I had a little involvement in that when I was a consultant to help draft the declaration and plan of action. However, was told very clearly, don't make any very clear targets in it. The same year, I also wrote this booklet for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization called Creating a Well-Fed World, and spent quite a lot of time talking to, the staff in FAO on, that's the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, on food security and how we could describe it in 2 pages. And we decided what we could do is talk about the ingredients that go to make for food security, because it depends whether you're talking at a household level, a nation, or the globe, or a region. Many different things affect food security. Imagine if the price, the exchange rate for the pound dropped by 50%, that would make a huge impact on the UK, which imports kind of over half its food. But it can go down to gender relationships in the household, who gets fed what, and priorities there. So a huge range of ingredients, and what matters most depends upon who you are and where you are in the world. The other thing that was happening in the 90s particularly was a huge change in the global rules affecting food. You had the creation of the Convention on Biological Diversity, a new international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, a new trade organisation, the World Trade Organization, a World Intellectual Property Organization, and an International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. Now, I could spend the entire time on this stuff, but I don't have the time for that. However, if you are interested, this book, which is free to download, you can read a lot more about each of these. The one I want to pick out is this new organisation, the World Trade Organization, and an agreement on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, because these brought minimum intellectual property standards into agriculture for the first time. Historically, farmers have shared seeds and knowledge and breeds to improve things. But these rules now require the patenting of microorganisms and some form of plant variety protection for members of the WTO. And they give an option not to patent plants and animals, but you don't always find that option is taken up by people. And the other thing that's really different about the World Trade Organization compared to the climate change deals or the biodiversity ones is it's a hard law institution. It has a dispute settlement system that is backed by sanctions. And so if you don't follow its rules, and you have to follow the rules if they join the club, forget anything about national sovereignty, you join this, you follow its rules, and if you don't, you get taken to the dispute settlement system. And the reason I'm mentioning this is intellectual property has become one of the key issues for who's going to have power over food this century, because it underpins the so-called knowledge economy and the media and entertainment model businesses, software, pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. And I guess everyone's now become aware how important this is over the vaccines issue in COVID-19. It also underpins brand power, the capacity you can use brands to advertise and cross-connect products like cartoon characters to marketing chocolate bars to children. But the key thing to remember about these things is they're given in supposedly for social benefit, but they are a means to exclude others, capture and appropriate benefits. The real life impact of this has been over the last 25 years or so, um, to see a huge change in this basis of the food system in the seed businesses, where these businesses in red, originally chemical companies, have progressively bought up and connected to more and more businesses, and now you're down to 3 major businesses controlling a huge part of the basics of the food system, seed production. ChemChina's bought Syngenta, Bayer's bought Monsanto, and Corteva is emerging of Dow and Dow in the US. So you've got very few companies who tend to control large chunks of the market. And this isn't just true in seeds, it's true in retailing, it's true in agrochemicals and so on. There's a lot more material about this if any of you are interested on my own website, which you can have a look at. Okay, so we've moved on into the 90s. All those things were happening. And by 1996, we had another World Food Summit because, hang on, things weren't going right. We hadn't sorted the food problem out. And by then, they came up with a better definition of food security, which is rather broader. A situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, and the word social was added in 2001, and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Clearly a much fuller understanding now internationally about food security, and 4 key words tended to be used: accessibility, availability, affordability and utilisation, i.e. are you healthy enough to utilise the food that you put in your body? What's missing is an understanding of the absence of fear that is engendered if you come to the end of one harvest period and before the next you don't have food to feed yourself, or that you don't have the money to get to food, or you can't access it. And we've seen that grow even now in the UK, especially in the last 10 years. Still missing, though, from this definition and others, is any sense of how the food's produced and the environmental sustainability of the food production system, nor any sense of who has power and control in that system and how that is shaped and controlled. Also in 2000, a special rapporteur on the right to food was established by the Commission on Human Rights. The right to food is embodied in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in Article 25, but has not been really pushed. And so they set this person to do this. And in the guidance on what states should do, it is the state's responsibility, obligation to respect, protect and fulfil the right to adequate food. Again, something that is really not being developed, although in Scotland at the moment, Nourish Scotland is proposing to introduce this into legislation. And there's an interesting interview with Olivier de Schutter, lecture by him on this website, and also from FAO if you're interested in this area. Personally, I was invited to join the Food Ethics Council in the UK in 2000. And I liked that and I accepted the invitation because of its approach in respecting the well-being of people, animals and the environment, autonomy, enabling people and animals to have meaningful choice in their lives and control, and justice in the sense of fairness, and using those to help balance and think about what's happening in the food system. Once again, I can't talk much about the FEC here, but please look at the website. There's a massive materials we have on that website from the, well, now nearly 22 years, I think, since it was started. Okay, we still haven't got to the end of thinking about food security, though. In 2009, the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK, which was abolished by the incoming government in 2010, tried to come up with a broader understanding of food security as being about genuinely sustainable food systems, where the core goal, and this is key, is to feed everyone sustainably, equitably and healthily, and addressing the needs for availability, affordability and accessibility, but which is also diverse and ecologically sound and resilient, an issue that will become increasingly important, and which builds the capabilities and skills necessary for future generations. Because around the world, the farming population is generally aging, and a lot of farmers don't want their children to go into farming because it's poorly rewarded and takes place in rural areas that are poorly served. The other big development in the last 20 years, since the 1996 Food Summit, was movements of peoples and peasants from initially from Latin America and Africa and Asia into a food sovereignty movement, talking about the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. This really in response to a modern approach to farming, or an industrial approach to farming, which doesn't see any space for peasants and small farmers in the future. And this group has now become really significant globally. And at the 2010 summit on food, 2009 summit on food security, they organised a parallel summit alongside that one that was happening in FAO in Rome, and that's the rapporteur on the right to food there that you may recognise. Coming up more or less to today, in the last 18 months or so, looking ahead towards 2030, the high-level panel of experts of the Committee on Food Security at FAO has tried to expand the thinking on food security to look at 6 dimensions, and really has now brought in those issues around agency, which is to do with power and control, and sustainability into the thinking, which have been missing in the way it's been addressed before. So that's given you a kind of overview picture of what's been happening at the global scale. But what has happened is that we've come to a situation today where the system is dysfunctional in terms of what I think a food system should do, because we still have a huge number of people who are undernourished in 2020, between 720 and 811 million. And according to a press release today from WHO, 40% of adults are overweight or obese in 2021. And the number of obese adults has almost tripled since 1975. And unhealthy diets are linked to at least 8 million deaths per year, which is so far more than COVID has killed. Everywhere, the dysfunctionality of the food system tends to affect the poorest most, in the north and the south. And in the US, they've got a huge food assistance program, used to be called food stamps, nearly $90 billion this year, and nearly 42 million participants. And also, most of the poorest people are still in rural areas. We still have a large number of smallholders, and small farmers still feed the majority of the world. And everywhere this is a highly gendered issue, women tend to be most badly affected, but in many parts of the world are also the major food producers. And finally, we have a massive loss of biodiversity and agricultural biodiversity. So we have a real problem. There is a clear failure of food systems to deliver healthy diets to people, as the head of the FAO said at the Committee on World Food Security 5 years ago. More prosaically, as you might expect from the World Bank, they summarise it up as food systems have come a long way, feeding a population up from 1.6 billion in 1900 to almost 7.6 in 2020, but are no longer fit for purpose. And they actually talk about the cash, looking at the fact that food systems today generate hidden costs, environmental, social, etc., estimated at between $6 and $12 trillion annually, while only generating a market value of around 10 trillion per year. So it doesn't really matter which angle you come from. This is not a system that makes sense for the future. And it was the first time it was discussed in something you probably missed, a one-day virtual summit at the UN this year, a highly contentious summit with another counter summit organised by Via Campesina and the Food Sovereignty Movement, and in which you can still see that 2 very different visions remain, as we were talking about when we launched food policy. These were characterised in a report from the European Commission about 10 years ago as the productivity narrative, and these are kind of 2 extremes. The productivity narrative is the one you hear most. Look, we're clever, we'll get technological fixes for all the problems we've got. Economic growth, it just has to happen, goes on forever. Demand just occurs, it's exogenous to the system, it's not created. And by the way, the one I've added is corporate feudalism, because the extension of the intellectual property rules globally means you'll only have a license to listen to your music, plant your seed, etc., etc., as large corporate bodies tend to control more and more of everything around us. The other narrative they talk about is a sufficiency narrative, which recognises an ecological balance is needed, diversity is a strength, and equity is essential, and also that there is a role and a continuing role for small farmers who understand and work in the different environments. And the challenge is, when I talked about humanity at a crossroads, you can see this through food most clearly. Do we want a world with the richest 2 billion okay and the rest not, and using farming systems that are increasingly problematic, or are we going to try and have some fundamental change? The Agriculture to Crossroads reports talks about the need to move to an agroecological farming systems from industrial fossil fuel based models and linking those to sustainable diets. So when we think about the future, we can't just think about it in terms of what happens in a food system, because the people in the food system are part of a bigger political and economic system, and you need a different economics that drives the decisions of what the actors do in that system. And there's been a lot of work on this, but it's still very peripheral. And including forgetting this measure of GDP and GNP as a good measure of human progress, because it doesn't measure it measures the goods and bads and ignores many of the goods. One of the things I think we need to do living in Europe and the UK is to have a different way of looking at the world. This is a Pacific-centred map of the world. We're used to seeing a European-centred map or a North Atlantic-centred map. And if you look at this map, we're on a little island somewhere off a rather small continent, where we've always thought we're the centre of the action, and it is changing. And we are also an area which has been responsible historically for the most greenhouse gas emissions, particularly the UK leading the Industrial Revolution, and also ecological debt, that we use far more of the world's resources than would be equitable on a fairly shared out basis. So we have to think, going beyond the current assumptions we have, that we can eat what we want, when we want, from wherever we want. Even if we could do that, should we be able to? And the big question for Britain is, and how is this going to play out in Brexit? The answer to which is, as yet, we don't know, but it doesn't look too promising. And the Countryside Commission director of this commission, Sue Pritchard, raised the kind of key question, I think, for us in Britain. What kind of country do we want to be? And what do we do as citizens really want from our food, farming and countryside? And we can look through the lens of foods to see how well or not we're doing in shaping the kind of society we want. I was shocked to be asked to chair a commission on food and poverty in 2014 in the UK, which would have been unthinkable in the 70s when I started, and at the point at which Britain was its most equal in the 20th century. We've now moved back to levels of inequality like the beginning of the 20th century. Hosted by the Fabian Society, supported by Esme Furban, independent, not party political. But we decided not to talk about food poverty, but food and poverty, because food is much broader, and food poverty narrows you down your thinking to thinking about food banks and the like. Food insecurity or food poverty isn't measured by the government, and it's hard to measure. Food is the most flexible item of expenditure for people. You have to pay other bills, otherwise you get evicted and don't have any heat. And there's a myth that healthy food's cheap. Calorie for calorie, it's more expensive. And some deprived and remote rural areas actually have a lack of access to affordable, healthy and sustainable food, and indeed some urban areas. And food plays a much bigger role in society. You are not able to fully participate in society if you can't exercise some choice, your own choice in food, and have the wherewithal to have party for your children and so on. It's relevant to identity and culture as well as sustenance. So we prefer people to talk about household food insecurity, which is the inability to acquire or consume an adequate quality or sufficient quantity of food in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that one will be able to do so. We produced a couple of reports in the mid-2010s, which sadly are both still relevant, and you can find them here, and this other one on this. They're now archived, but they are available on the web through those addresses. Can't go into them all, but we came up with five, summarised the 14 actions we call for into 5 areas. Action on realising the right to food and holding governments to account on that. Measuring and tackling food insecurity, which I'm pleased to say is about to be done. Incomes, low pay, benefits and the poverty premium have to be addressed. You need decent jobs. You need the poorest not to pay more for everything than the rich do. You need action on public health, sugar and advertising and sustainability. And you need food access and local food action plans. And there is quite a lot of work going on in different parts of these areas. But we also need to be aware of the kind of innovation we need to secure our food future. It is not simply about technology. It can be local, the Preston model for procurement, institutional, political, social, economic and legal. All these different areas will require kinds of innovation, not just technology and production, linking those to sustainable and healthy and equitable consumption. The other thing is people talk about innovation as if it's a good thing. It's not. Maybe terrible. And that's the problem that led to the financial crash of 2008, from which we're still suffering. And the head of the Rich Worlds Club said the problem was because financial innovation was done in excess, driven by an ever increasing thirst for short term profit. We now need to rewrite the rules of finance and global business. And we need to do that in the food system. There's a lot of work gone on in this. There's a people's food policy that's been developed by a group across the UK, which you might want to have a look at. And you've probably heard of the National Food Strategy, which has gone to the government, still waiting for their response on this. Far enough as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. And we also now have the Sustainable Development Goals, which our government and nearly all governments in the country, in the world, are signed up to. The second of which is Zero Hunger, which is about ending hunger, achieving food security and improved nutrition and promoting sustainable agriculture. That covers the main things we're talking about by 2030. The idea that we have to do this by 2030 in a country that shouldn't have anyone and is very clearly nothing to do with the amount of food available, but the structures that we have that mean people can't access that food is scandalous in my view. Okay, so what do you do? I think there's 4 dimensions for action. I'm nearly getting to the end, don't worry. And I draw this from different people. You first of all think who acts? Individuals in community, and corporate actors. Think of that as an x-axis. What is the end of their action directed to? Is it revolution in the way we do things? Is it a reform of things? Is it supporting renaissance from the bottom up? Or is it resistance to things going in a direction that are not desirable? The third element is what levers do they use to achieve these ends? The biggest levers for change are changing the paradigm, the thinking, changing the rules, being absolutely clear about the goal that you have and what your food system is designed to do, and then measuring up whether things are making that come about or not. And this is taken from Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems book. Brilliant, recommend it to everyone. And the final thing is you've now created a 3-dimensional space, and you have to look at where power and control is moving in that space and decide which bits you want to work with, work around, undermine or support, and what connections need to be made to press for the particular area of concern that you have. So what do you do? Well, there's lots of different people arguing you should do. Eat real food, Michael Pollan, eat local food, minimise the high-fat, sugar processed stuff that fills so much of the shelves. Eat mostly plant-based diets, not ultra-processed meat substitutes, and minimising dairy, meat, sugar, oils and fats. Grow and cook and pass on growing and cooking skills and seeds. Share knowledge. Support local farmers, fair trade products, sustainably farmed approaches such as organic conservation farming. But centrally, connect with others. Citizens can act collectively, consumers act, but then what you find is that the market will open a new niche for a particular consumer conscience, not necessarily change in its structure. Individuals in community, well, that might be in a school, hospital, workplace, religious groups. You can look at the procurement policies for the places that buy food. Do they stipulate anything about the way it's produced and where? You can, in those, either internally or use those bodies to change and lobby for the change that you think, but also start new kind of enterprises built on the values that will bring about, hopefully, a better food system. And corporately, then you've got to look at different areas of action, changing the policies, rules and incentives. What's the incentives for the buyers in the supermarkets? Is it to take sustainability into account and fair wages, or is it to screw down your suppliers to the lowest cost and play them off against each other? Look beyond food to what encourages bad practices. Don't advertise high-fat sugar foods to children. Ensure fair returns to farmers and workers, and support and start new business models like co-ops. And I would also add oppose monopoly controls, such as patents, on any part of the food system, especially over seeds and animals. Otherwise, you'll find that the pharmaceutical model you're seeing is causing considerable problems now will be the one that will dominate the food system of tomorrow. And there are joint initiatives like Sustainable Foods Places. This is perhaps a bit big for us, but multinationally, you need to look at supporting the multinational, multilateral system in the Committee on Food Security rather than a global partnership of the rich countries to structure the world as they would like to see it go. You need to make sure commodity trading is controlled so food isn't used as a speculative asset class like it was in 2008. And neither should soil, carbon and agriculture become a new commodity. And stocks, we actually need real grain reserves around the world to cope with the fact that harvests will fail. This idea was there after the World Food Summit conference in 1974 and has never been achieved. There's a really interesting paper that you might want to have a look at, talking about painting one scenario for the future, which is the high-tech, perhaps less desirable one, and then looks at 10 opportunities for making that different. And finally, we come to home. This is where we all live. It's the only place we know in the universe, and if you've been watching, if you can get through it, the universe program, that is likely to hold life comfortable for us. Many peoples, much diversity, and what climate change has shown us is that the global is local and the local is global. What started locally has become a global change. And the thing we should all remember is we've each of us got a 200-year perspective back to our grandchildren, grandparents, and hopefully forward to ours or our friends' grandchildren. So what about climate? That is the big question of how we're going to cope with this. And this is the lecture I recommend you watch by another guy from Leeds, University of Leeds. It's an hour-long lecture. It's a really interesting one. But climate change and agriculture are closely interconnected and completely missing from the final declaration of the COP26 meeting. And Tim's conclusions, which I think are broadly right, is the food system we've got has delivered lots of food cheaply, but it's done so putting costs onto people and the planet. And farmers are not typically to blame for this because it's the framework in which they operate that drives them to do the things they do. And eating a healthy diet is also eating a more sustainable one. But we need really deep system change and looking at a vision of the world we want and then measuring up how we're getting there. But if we don't change diets, we are into dangerous climate change and unsustainable land use. So that's me racing through an indigestible, I hope I haven't given you too much indigestion, overview. Please use some of the resources that exist on this Food Systems Academy, which I curate, which includes the lecture by Tim and various others. And also there's a paper if you want to read it, which has lots of references in it from a few years ago. And finally, there's my own website, which you've seen some of. So thank you very much. I hope that's been about 45 minutes and that you're still with me. I can't see any of you, so I don't know if you've all gone to sleep.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I have unmuted myself. There's so much, so many issues were raised in your talk. They're very rich. So I'm going up to the top of the chat so that I'll deal with them as they come. So I think Harvey, if you're there, you might like to ask your own question.
Well, actually, Janie, I think it's probably best to move on to the second one. I think Geoff answered the question quite well in the subsequent slide. So it might be best just to go on to the first one, I think.
Okay, so I think actually that was my questions. What are the strengths and limitations in Dimbleby's national food strategy? I mean, you mentioned that there were some good things about it, but interesting to know what you thought were the highlights and what, where it's lacking.
Well, it's now quite a while since I read it, and I'm not sure I can fully answer your question now, Janie. My sense is that the analysis is very good, that there's a very comprehensive analysis, but that you could have a far more ambitious range of recommendations, that the recommendations happen, if you like, within the framework that we've got, rather than challenge it in a more radical way. That would be my overview comment from it. I could recommend you look at the Sustain website to see their response to it. And I don't remember if we as the Food Ethics Council have put one out or not. But you might find some of those comments from Sustain who've done a much more thorough analysis than I will have done. So I'm sorry about that.
That's right. I think one thing that I did see mentioned somewhere was was there a suggestion in the report that the Food Standards Agency should be given the power to sort of, you know, control or keep an eye on what was happening, on to monitor, and that's seen as a very weak body to be doing something like this?
Yeah, apparently Tim Lang's had an article in The Guardian and people have been commenting on that. I noticed a couple of letters today. The Food Standards Agency, I think, was very narrowly conceived, or conceived of itself rather narrowly, thinking about food safety, very much focused on. And if we're talking about food standards, you could have a much more expansive thinking about it. What are the standards you need in a food system to deliver the goal I talked about at the beginning, safe, sufficient, nutritious food for everyone with equity? And I think there's those question of a definition there. Yes, it would need to be strong and robust. It did have, I think, a very interesting chairperson who didn't stay there very long, and I think had a more ambitious aim for it. There's a real problem in having agencies that want to be critical, if you like, of the way government runs and makes radical suggestions about it. So it would be good to have a robust and independent one, able to challenge and monitor what was going on, but also, I say, hold to account.
Yes.
Under the Sustainable Development Goals, which I say we're signed up to, I think it's number 16 or 17, civil society organisations are encouraged to hold governments to account to achieve these goals. So, you know, governments are very good at signing up to really great sounding things. And a lot of the things they've signed up to over the years have sounded very good, but actually turn them into practice that's made the real difference is the challenge.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. So I think Steve and Dawn, would you like to to say your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you talked about needing a new economic system because what you're proposing does require, it seems, really quite radical changes, really. And what I really find interesting is Kate Raworth's donut economics concept. And I just wondered whether you'd thought about that in terms of what you've been talking about today and at all.
Yeah, I remember I was in a seminar with that, or a webinar recently. Yeah, it is useful thinking. And again, can I remember it all exactly? No, I can't at the minute. When we're talking about a new economic system, we need an economics that is subservient to the needs of human beings and the ecology and the planet and the biosphere that we live in, rather than the other way around. And an economics that different people have been coming up with approaches to. You've got the steady state people, you've Herman Daly's work, you've got the Kate Raworth work. I think it's about bringing all those together and looking at how they would produce something that would enable the actors in these systems to behave differently. Because it's very difficult to be, you know, to be totally ethical in a system that doesn't encourage you to be so and may not reward you for doing so. I think your earlier comment about how much progress has there been made, Harvey, some, but way nowhere near enough. I mean, I have done a module in a course from Lancaster University that's an online course that you have to pay for on ethical food systems. And I know that some people in the industry have taken it, and some people are trying to, within their businesses, see how they could do those things. But it is quite challenging if then your competitors can do something different that you know, that they might drive you out of business with. And I think the other thing there on the economic system is that even the orthodoxy, even Sarkozy, when he was president of France, got Stiglitz to do a review of not using the measures that we use, the wrong measures. And if you use the wrong measures, you get the wrong result. This use of GNP and GDP as the core measure of whether or not a society is working, because we know that GNP only measures certain things, so that it measures things that have a monetary value. And you have an accident and you cause lots of things to be spent and this and that and the other, you'll increase the GDP. It's not a good thing for you to do. But if you look after or in a occurring role with somebody, it's not recognised at all. So these beginnings to think about gross national happiness and so on, I think they're all elements of something that, you know, there's a movement towards that, but it is a very long way from the dominant one. And I think Kate Raworth's work and others is all helping push towards thinking in a different way. I don't know if that really answers you, Steve, but there you go.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. It all helps to move the Overton window slightly, and that's maybe the only step we can take at this point. So yeah, I agree. I mean, Kate Rowith is all about that. Yeah.
But also, you see, in a sense, some of the people trying different business models, and if they can work, the development of co-ops, and I suppose now you've got the community interest companies and so forth.
Mm.
Once you start to change some of those legal frameworks, then you facilitate new ways of people of doing things, and if they can kind of become better than the established ones, then you do stand a chance of having some change from the way people are managing business.
Mm.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so Priscilla's question, do you want to?
Yes, okay. I mean, I was wondering about population. The world population's ballooned partly as a result of medical advances and technological advances, and this is suggesting that we are better returning to a more, I hesitate, traditional form of agriculture, but at least to eliminate some of the chemicals that have been used, etc. Now, if we do this, I mean, how do you think that there'll be enough for everybody to eat, or will there have to be some form of population control, or will it all naturally come together? But maybe that's a bit too much of an ask, is it?
Well, this is a big question, which I'll try and do elements of.
I can't quite hear you, actually.
Sorry, Geoff. You can never talk about population and feeding people unless you talk about what people eat and the nature of the diets that we have.
Yeah.
When I talked to the father of the Green Revolution in India, MS Swaminathan, he talked about it as being a kind of stopgap to help feed people while you reorganize things so that everyone was, well fed, and you didn't get monopolies, you didn't get, monocultures, and he talked about it turning from a green revolution to a greed revolution. There's an interview with him on the blog I do if you look him up. And what we've seen is the technological development. We've been able to feed people, more or less everyone in the world, during my whole lifetime. The reason we haven't been able to do that is to do with the structures that exist that disable people from being rural people from being able to manage their farming and food efficiently and effectively. But in terms of the technology, I think there's a big challenge, and it links into, someone talked about GM and things. We still have, I think, a very old-fashioned view of science and technology, 19th century positivist control over nature, Bacon, etc. And I think the really modern science is that we're beginning to understand how the ecology works, how our complex Earth system works. We're beginning to understand the real complex nature of our soil systems. This is the most complex thing in the planet, soil. It's physical, chemical, biological system with more organisms in the soil in a good handful than there are people on the planet, which we're only just beginning to understand. And the way that modern science and technology is developing, it could help us to go into a new way of looking at how we work with these ecological cycles and maintain them, rather than saying we're going to create a farming system, for example, which has a monoculture, which is a fantastic breeding ground for pests, to defeat the pesticides that you put on, because nature is always moving, always changing, as you can see with this virus. So we could be starting to say, how do we do farming systems that develop using this new way and using some of the insights we're getting from our understanding of how living organisms work, rather than say we're going to continue with our technical fix and carrying on the way we want and trying to use the fixes for the problems that doing this causes. Does that make sense? I'm trying to. So there's I think over a time, if people are better served in rural areas, if women have education, if they have access to birth control, and if they have much greater control over the resources and the things they have, you will see a period when the population will go up and then will level off, as we've seen historically. But it's very clear that most of the time, barring conflicts and the use of food as weapons, we have enough food on this planet to feed everyone. And it's utterly clear in Britain. The reason people go hungry in Britain or don't have access to food is not because there's not enough food. and it's reason why food and poverty, it's about poverty, folks. It's not about food. But it's about the impact being poor has on you and your ability to eat well and to access food. And it depends which part of modern agriculture has produced a lot, but it has also had these immense costs. And I think the Centre for Alternative Technology, one of the people there, I remember talking to him about, we should see this fossil fuel thing as an amazing interlude, which has given us an amazing ability to increase the standard of living of lot, but it's the one we have to get out of, because if we don't, we will see it all dip down. Sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded response.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, it's a very complex issue, isn't it? Yeah, that one. Okay, so now wait a minute, I'm just scrolling down here. Sorry, I've lost. Wait a minute.
Reinhard next. I'm looking down myself.
Is it okay if you can see it? Sorry, I've jumped too much. Yes, there's Reinhard. Yes, that's right. Okay, Reinhard, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Geoff, for the very interesting talk. You mentioned advertising and marketing a bit. In my question is that I feel it plays a key role in the problem and needs to be addressed. And I have worked as a medical doctor in Africa, where it's also a problem, or where it's more noticeable, where I saw farmers or women with malnourished children converting their own produce into Coke and other soft drinks because they thought that according to the advertisement, it would be a good thing to give the Coke to their child. So I called it the Coke syndrome. And I feel it's also in our society, but it's less obvious that people spend, I think, an enormous amount of money on convenient junk food. And yes, and I mean, I also, when I was in Africa, I was welcomed in villages by being given a Coke or a Fanta. And when I asked for some local drink, the people looked at me with astonishment because it was seen as a sort of most important gift to give to me, to buy a Coke for me. So I feel, and that applies also to the UK, to Leeds. I see it every day. And yes, so I would like to find out what you think. I for instance, think advertisement should be made illegal or at least highly taxed, because I think it doesn't serve any useful purpose if we talk about rational beings acting in an economy. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, right. Well, first thing, the point of advertising is to help you not think. I think you have to think about that, because it is there's lots of stuff I cut out from this possible presentation, one of which was a slide about health being total, the WHO definition of health being physical, mental, and so on well-being, complete, not the absence of disease. And a comment from Gerard Hastings, the director of the Institute for Social Marketing, on that the advertising and marketing of multinational corporations today undermines people's mental and mental health, particularly today. You use advertising. Most advertising doesn't advertise the properties of the product. It advertises something you want to attach to the product that you want people to aspire to. And when you talk about Coke and that, it's also like meat. If the rich have this stuff, you want to be like the rich, or if the culturally quote unquote superior have this, then you want to have this. It becomes a social and cultural aspiration. And that's what you try and encourage people to aspire to and to want. The other element is, it is always about increasing wants. As Manfred Max Neef, in his structure for thinking about human needs, said, we've got very few human needs fundamentally, only about 9. The need for protection, understanding, subsistence, it's about 9 of them. And you meet them by being, doing, having, and becoming, being active. Sorry, I forgot to unplug my phone. Hopefully someone will answer that somewhere in the house in a minute. Not me. I will unplug this, hang on. Oh, they've done it. So you know that you can meet our needs in different ways, and some things undermine others. And I think advertising is there to encourage us to want things that we don't need. And it is also built upon intellectual property, because it's about the ability to have a trademark that is yours globally, that you can project and use this. So there's an intimate connection between having the capacity and power of advertising with the intellectual property regime, particularly connected with trademarks, which helps you then project. So I think there's a kind of mix. Should advertising be banned? Interesting. I'd like to see you get that through. I do think, for example, you could say there has to be a pound for pound tax on all advertising of junk food, which then has to go equally to advertising or marketing, basic foodstuffs like you saw on that slide from the Force Fed. I do think reading that paper from the Food Foundation is a very useful one to look at the kind of complex mix of things that goes to shape people's aspirations and food choices. Britain's also a very odd country. We were the first industrial revolution country. We've got the least connection problem of most countries with farming or food and people knowing where that come from. And we are therefore, I think, quite an outlier. But what you said in where you've been, and I've been in places where you're an honoured guest, so they want to give you the most appropriate thing that they think would honour you. And if that has been the thing that people have got through the advertising and the marketing and the product placement, if you look at a modern film, there's very nothing that's got a trademark on it or a logo on it is probably there by accident. You pay for product placement in films. That's how you get them going, all the Apple computers you see and so on. So yeah, it's really important that we should manage and control this advertising and marketing, because it's about creating discontent. That's what I would say.
But I mean, this government has shown itself rather reluctant, I think, when there's been, attempts by various food experts on food to suggest food taxes, taxes on sugary content and that kind of thing. That they
have managed to do it on it should be extended further, but it's also been shown to have a positive effect upon consumption patterns and so forth. And we should recognise that when we did the work in the Fabian Commission on Food and Poverty, whilst childhood obesity was being tackled in most socioeconomic groups, in the poorest quintile, it wasn't. It was still going up. But the other thing to recognise is a lot of foodstuffs are designed to give you that pleasure when you put it in your mouth, the mouthfeel. The huge technological work goes on to produce something that will give you that buzz. And food is also about pleasure. It's also about reward. It's also about compensation. If it's one of the few things you can afford that gives you something, then you can do that. It's really quite complex there.
It's a question. Dougal, do you want to read out your question?
Yes, I was wondering how soil depletion, soil degradation sits as a medium-term threat to food security. Is it in the same league as climate change?
Pretty high.
Right.
I don't know how you would put the two. Yeah. I mean, there is the continuing in the UK mining of the lands in the east, in the Lincolnshire and so forth.
Right.
Globally, there's a lot of problem with irrigated lands being salinated. We have a lot of topsoil loss. If I mentioned in China now, there's a lot of windblown soil loss, like you saw in the United States in different areas. And soils are really central. Living, vibrant soils. I was on a conference call where someone was saying, a farmer said to me, it doesn't matter what happens in the soil, I just put the fertilizer on and this on it. And that is really not the way you need to think about your soil. And also soil is a huge potential carbon sequestration place, but not using it as a carbon credit, but using it as somewhere you build up the carbon to give you the resilience that you're going to need. I think also there's a big report from the FAO on that. There's an excellent soil atlas produced by the EU looking at soils around the world. Hang on a second. I can recommend that as you want to have a look at the state of play.
Okay.
of European soils.
Yeah.
And it's also free to download online.
Okay.
If you want to look that up, Soil Atlas of Europe from the European Commission.
Okay.
A really good overview. There's quite a few reports from FAO about the dire state of soils and the need to look after the soils more than we have. That's where I'm saying the modern understanding we're beginning to get through ecology and biology and so on gives us an opportunity to work with these and build upon the capacities soils and other systems have to build resilience into our food systems in the future.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Geoff. I think Rosie, you have a question? Is Rosie there? Oh yes, there you are, Rosie. Do you want to?
I was very pleased to see the Indian farmers actually succeed in their campaign against the Indian government's attempt to so-called modernize the systems. Well, so far anyway. Have you got any sense of which particular kinds of groups in the UK might have the most chance of successfully campaigning together to challenge and change, possibly change, at least challenge the government's policies in this country?
Well, I think, as I said about that, who acts and how they act, it would depend upon which policy and which area you're looking at. So you might find sometimes very strange supporters coming together over a particular policy area. If you, in general, the Sustain network of NGOs, Sustain is somewhat group I'd recommend you looking at. The Sustainable Food Places network now, which is trying to work through local government and develop. It used to be called Sustainable Food Cities, but since not everywhere's a city, I'm glad they've changed their name. And I think, again, it would depend where. It's sometimes the Soil Association, their Food for Life programme has been very successful in influencing standards of catering in schools. And sometimes you'll find a particular business or group of businesses who have an interest in supporting a change that you think is appropriate. It's very difficult to talk in general terms about this. It depends each one. And maybe they can make common cause together, because not all businesses are the same. Not all people in them are monolithic. Often you'll find people, when they move out of either government or business, much more progressive in what they'd like to see done than when they were in it and weren't able to do it. So it's also about finding those people who know the inside and can help you understand the constraints that people have, and whether you can do something to either remove those constraints or use other levers to get them to change policy. And it does also change with governments, which government is in and which particular perspective they're looking at the economy from. Don't know if that helps, Rosie. It's you know, I do have this terrible sense of deja vu, as I said, looking at what we were discussing in the 70s when I started and what we're still discussing today. Despite we have made a huge lot of changes, and we have, you know, as it said, you know, been able to feed a lot of people, but we've done it in a way that probably undercuts our sustainability in the long term.
Yeah. There's a question from Andy Beck. Andy, are you there?
Yes, I am indeed. You mentioned at the very beginning that something happened in 1972 that looked forward 50 years. And so 50 years on, was that a useful exercise?
Well, interestingly, it was trashed a lot of time, and of course the economic growth continues at all costs. Group were not very happy with it, but I was sent a link to an article in, of all places, the Daily Mail, by a major, I think it was one of these accountancy agencies, I don't know which one, reviewed it and thought, well, its findings were pretty well good. You know, they were fairly accurate, that we are going to run up against different resource constraints, and that we do have, using the resources we have, are likely to have some major problems with managing the future. So yes, it was. I think it was worthwhile. We've seen many more since then. Herman Daly, I mentioned earlier, has done a lot of work about how we need to rethink these growth systems. it is a useful exercise. I think one of the things that I did mention at the end is we need to have a vision of where we want to go. What kind of world, what kind of country do we want to be? What are the things we'd like to see a world be like, right? And we've suddenly realized that all the money we spend on security from a military point of view can't achieve the security we need from climate change, from pandemics, from inequality, etc. And if you'll allow me to share my screen for a second, that is something I have tried to talk about in a couple of blogs I did. This is one. I did another one. I'm trying to find where the other one is, for Rethinking Security website. Because, and I think if you listen to the Dimbleby lecture last night, they were talking there about the need to, sorry, I'll stop that. There is another blog which I could send afterwards. There is a need to see, if we want a world which I would say, looking 100 years ahead, if I had grandchildren, which I currently don't, they'd all be alive if we're lucky then. Now, is that a world in which we would have got closer to everyone being well-fed and healthy, a more equitable world? What would be the markers for getting us there? What would be the things that telling us we're going in the wrong direction? So if you're clear about a goal that you want, you may not be able to go straight to it. It's like a sailing ship. You can't go in a straight line. You have to wiggle around and sometimes go back on yourself and go forwards. But you do at least know where you want to go. And I think that's one of the key things, and it's in the Thinking in Systems book. You have to be clear about the goals that you're trying to achieve, because then you can have some sense of whether you're getting nearer to them or not. So I think if we did have some visions of the future, I would like to see some work being done to say, if we were serious about really tackling these challenges to human security this century, could we have a progressive switch of the resources that go into the military everywhere, progressively, using some of the skills they have to deal with the challenges, but then moving them into areas that would address the questions of poverty and that would address questions of climate and so on. And that would be a really rethinking of what it is for human security on this pretty little planet that we live on. There you go, Andy.
Okay, shall I? Because there are still a few questions.
Yeah, go on.
So I'll push on with the questions. I think the question I raised, somebody has sort of given me a response, although which I can come back to later if necessary. Okay, Christina, are you still here?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just a bit worried that because we've come out of the EU and we're doing everything we can to get trade deals, and we don't seem to be worrying about what we give up to get them, whether we're in a really bad position. I would have preferred to have stayed with the EU as well, to have a bit more strength in negotiating improvements to how farming is done. I just wonder if you have any thoughts of what can be done.
Well, several thoughts. One, I don't think trade deals should all be done in secret and should be actually published before they're agreed, and that we have proper debates about whether or not they're a good thing. Most trade deals are done in secret all over the world, and it's a real problem because people will trade off incommensurables, you know, chalk and cheese, and farming basically doesn't bring much into the UK's GDP. So there'll be groups who are saying, well, it doesn't really matter that much, you know, we can get food cheaper elsewhere. And kind of, in quotation marks, cheap food is not necessarily good food for all the criteria we've talked about. It enables you to keep wages low and all kinds of other things. So there's an issue about transparency in trade deals. Secondly, the content of trade deals. And there's a lot of pressure that we will be under to have stronger intellectual property protections with certain, if we start to deal with the US. You were dead right in the comment about power. Trade deals are about economic interests and bargaining power. And basically, we've chucked away a great deal of chunk of bargaining power because we're a tiddling little island of 60 million people. Okay, still quite rich, but in a world of 7.6 billion with, you know, China, the US, India, Brazil, the EU, etc., other big beasts in the negotiating field. And in the experience I had working with negotiators at WTO and developing countries, it's only if they got together as a group could they stand up for what they wanted. So I think there's a real issue on the kind of things that will be agreed to in trade deals. We should not have any trade deals that have these investor dispute settlement systems in them, because they enable companies to challenge and sue governments for possible loss of profits that might occur because of legislation that might be to do with health or climate or what have you. So those things are really bad. I think if we're talking about a society in which citizens have this final say in what happens rather than corporate actors or the most powerful in it. So there's a few thoughts, Christina.
Yes, Maureen.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's a question here from Paul Magnol. Paul, are you there?
I think Paul's left, I think I saw.
Okay.
Paul's had to leave.
Right.
Okay, well, basically, yes, food waste is very important, both before it gets to the consumer and when it gets to the consumer. There's a huge amount of waste globally, depends where you are. There's a lot of waste in fields because of poor marketing systems and difficulties of blocks in marketing systems. There's a problem with cosmetic requirements for products, so that a great deal of stuff isn't sold because it's too big, too little, too ugly, or what have you. Seen a little bit of change in that in some of the supermarkets now. The promotions that often encourage you to buy one get one free, etc., can include overbuying. Buffet systems that are not well managed produce lots of waste. So yeah, food waste is an important area, and it is part of a solution in diminishing the impact of the food system on climate impact, because all the food that's produced has a greenhouse gas emission cost. And if you don't use it, then it's a complete waste of time, and it will probably increase emissions actually through decomposition and releasing methane, unless it's captured in biogas. So yes, food waste is very important. RAP is the stubble. RAP is one group. There's the official group looking at food waste in the UK. There's Hubbub, which is working on some of these areas, and various others have been working in this and trying to enable people to see the ways of avoiding food waste.
Well, I hope we are moving on that. It's been, we've been aware of it for a very long time, but it would be good to know whether we're actually achieving, we're making any progress. So Rosie, I think you've got a question. Another question here on GMO.
Rosie, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. You appear to be unmuted, but we can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Rosie. Shall I read out your question, Rosie? Okay. What is your view on GMO foods, including CRISPR? The UK government would like to allow them, it seems.
Well, currently we don't allow GMO foods, although we are talking about allowing GM crops in the UK and the use of different technologies. I go back to the point I made about the nature of the technologies and what we're trying to use them for, and whether it's to kind of keep the system going that we've got by restructuring animals, for example, so they don't feel pain, because we're going to put them in systems that if you left them in their basic conditions, they would. I think it's a problem if for people who don't want to consume these things, or for the organic farmers in terms of plants, because seeds move, winds get blown around. It's a problem if the products in question are patented, because it's a question of control over that system. So I think there's a whole set of issues around it, and it's not simply oh, it'll make this more efficient, and there may be different ways of doing it. For example, there are GM blight resistant potatoes being developed in the Sainsbury labs, I think, in East Anglia, but there are also blight resistant potatoes being developed in North Wales without any using of these technologies. So there are different ways of doing them, and what is the question that's trying to be addressed, and is it something that is overall going to lead to the kind of food system that we need, I think, is the questions that we need to ask on that. I think the UK is very likely, this government particularly, will want to allow all this if they can.
Yes.
I'm delighted to read Tom's thing about
Yes. I mean,
what's happening in
is
Leeds,
Tom- is Tom here?
feedleeds.org. Where
Yes,
is
Tom's
Tom?
here. Do you want to speak, Tom?
Yeah, just to pick up. Hi, Geoff. We met when we did the Can We Feed Yorkshire event in Bradford.
That's a while ago.
Yeah, it is. We've been pressing on. Les Furbank, who's was chair of sustainable agriculture at of Leeds, spoke with you. Was working with us. He's retired now. Yes, just so if anybody's interested in knowing what's happening in Leeds, I'm vice chair of Feed Leeds and one of the people who set up Food Wise Leeds. Most of this stuff happens at Food Wise Leeds, actually, but that has a slightly less open structure. But if you want to get involved, come along to the Feed Leeds meetings, and we can feed into that. We submitted a report to the CEAC committee, the Climate Emergency Committee, in about this time 2 years ago now, and we asked really for one senior executive or member with the word food in their title. When we submitted lots of other things, but that's what it boiled down to. They've responded. They've appointed a food champion. They have put together a team of senior officers chaired by Polly Cook, who's the main climate officer. And they're working towards a sustainable food strategy, something we've been pushing for over 10 years. And only a couple of months ago, Councillor Marshall Katung announced the Leeds new food commitments, which the first city in the UK to do this. And we are well ahead on climate change than many other cities because of the great work being done. University of Leeds at the Priestley Centre, we've got 6 IPCC lead authors, including Tim Benton. But a lot of the work that Andy Gouldston's been doing is really giving us a push ahead. And although they're not as big on food as I want them to be, these are the commitments. So don't mention waste. I didn't have anything to do with these. So buy local, serve local. We'll increasingly source more of the food we serve from producers based in Yorkshire and surrounding counties. That's the council, but the ambition is to make that the whole city do that. You can read them yourself rather than me reading them out. I talked long enough.
No, it's really interesting, and it picks up that last point I made in the recommendations that came out of the Fabian Commission, which was having local food plans and local food action plans. There has been a lot of work. I couldn't cover any of that. You've got beyond the food bank work across the London boroughs. You've got stuff in Birmingham, Brighton and Hove, Bristol, lots of places. I don't know if you know about or you signed up to in Leeds the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration.
Yes, we have signed
it. That should be spread around, Nourish Scotland.
Yep.
I think you'll find around the world municipalities and even states in the United States, some of them can be far more progressive than the national governments and recognise the problems and actually have to deal with them locally. I think one of the challenges we've had in Britain is that the capacity of local governments to do things has been greatly reduced because of the reduction in funding they've got, yet the responsibilities then given have been increased, and then they carry the blame for not being able to do everything. And that is a real problem that you actually do need, and that's about power. That is about agency, and who has agency. The thing I was talking about in the meaning of food security. And so it's about the level at which you look at food security and how you break that down. I know it seemed very over there, all these food security definitions, but they actually have some meaning and some use. And I think using these things that governments have said they're committed to and holding them to account for and saying, hang on, you're committed to this, but you're doing this is really important. Hypocrisy doesn't need to rule, and we must make sure it doesn't. Because the good things they've said they want to do are good. Permaculture is useful. I can see Paul put that in there. Is he still here?
No, he's gone.
He's gone.
But if anybody wants to know about permaculture, Leeds happens to be the global headquarters of the permaculture movement, based here in Leeds.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you've put a couple of things in the chat, further information in the chat to a response to Reinhardt's. I'm sure he's seen the link there. And you were talking about the soils. You're giving us information about soils, the film called Kiss the Ground on Netflix.
Yeah, it's a very good film. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to see if I can give you Charlie's Place. Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, maybe I can just raise with my question earlier on was that, you know, there are lots and lots of groups around the UK in food production and sustainable food production, but I wondered to what extent they're really linked up. Now, Tom was just saying, well, in Leeds they are, well, and also linked with the national, but then why aren't we seeing more impact on policy? You know, if these groups are linked up to the extent you say, you know, why isn't it having any effect?
I wish I knew. I think there's several things. One is the UK is not a unitary state in one way, because it has a devolved administration in Northern Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland, and they're all doing different things. The Scots have a apparently much more progressive approach. They've got a Good Food Nation bill, they've got a lot of work by Nourish Scotland going on, and there's a different work happening in Wales, and then there's the English, which is by far the most difficult area to bring about change as far as I can see. I think the different groups they're also always nearly run by people volunteering or with a bit of their job to do this, and they're all busy where they are. And the space that you need to make that connection and the collaborative work is often difficult to achieve. I think there's an issue for funders in the charitable sector who fund in food, but there are not enough of them. I mean, Esme Fairbairn is one of the biggest. Joseph Roundtree's done some, and various other smaller charities, in trying to build a synergy between these and making an impact. It's hard to know. I mean, the People's Food Policy was a very good, I think, piece of work that did work around the country to try and come up with that and work with different people. I had a tiny hand in it, but trying to keep that going, again, it's a group of volunteers. And if you have increasingly constrained budgets in local authorities or even in companies, the sectors that are promoting sustainability in a company, and I can't name names, or I know one where someone who's been on a course and wants to do things, they're having to, they have to argue with the manager, they have to argue with the boss. So there's this real kind of challenge to bring about these connections. I hope that we can see a greater connection. I should say Sustain is a useful umbrella group. I recommend anyone to look at what they do and see if there are groups in there. So that's all I could think of for that, Janie.
Right, thank you very much. Oh yes, I think Tom was giving more information. I think, I don't think, oh yes, there's a question here from Stephen Dawn. Another question at the end about supermarkets.
Yeah, I was in Marks and Spencer's yesterday, Marks and Spencer's Food last night, and was talking to one of the people on customer services. She told me that I was talking to her about food waste, and she said that now every evening a different charity goes to that M&S food branch and gets the food waste that they haven't sold. And I don't know whether it's the food that's just out of date or goes out of date that day, but she says that they try very hard not to waste food now, at least at that end of it all. And I just wondered whether that is just Marks and Spencer's, or is that a legal requirement now, or how does that fit into what is happening in other supermarkets?
Not a legal requirement. There's been one group whose name I am desperately trying to remember and currently can't, and I really should.
Fair Share?
No, it's not Fair Share. It's probably one that, sorry. I did a lot of work trying to look at policies that would minimise waste. Fair Share does redistribute material. I mean, I think there's a real challenge in this. The system creates the food waste because you've got to have this stuff that's got to be used by this day. You have it on the shelves, you must have it on the shelves, then you have to take it off and put it somewhere. So you've got a system that necessarily creates stuff that has to be chucked away at the end because it isn't all going to get sold. Last thing you want is an empty shelf. And then you've got a lot of people who need food. But as Graham Riches points out, in fact, you're removing people's agency. If all they're going to get is what's left over, they'd have the choice. This is what you can have because this is what we've got left. Which, in terms of your social and cultural position in a society and your mental well-being, is a different thing to saying, yes, I can go out and choose to buy what I need to buy for myself or my family. It's necessary at the moment because we've got these conditions where people have to do that. And it's good that it doesn't go to waste, but there isn't, as far as I'm aware at the moment, any law that requires them to do this. There has been pressure to try and get that built into law, but it does actually throw up the whole question of the model that we have of supermarkets and the assumption that you can walk into any supermarket at any time of the year and you can eat what you want from wherever you want, seasons or not.
Yeah.
Which again is a change in our whole food culture from I guess, when I was little, when strawberries became dirt cheap in the summer because there was a hell of a lot of them and you couldn't get them in other parts of the year. But now the way the market operates is you get them at a relatively similar price even when there's a lot of them and they could be cheaper, or when there's very few of them and they'd be a lot more expensive. The way the pricing structure works. So you know, we have a very interesting and a very complex food system, but also quite delicate, because it also depends on the just-in-time manufacturing system developed by Toyota. When, you know, half of the food we're ever going to eat is somewhere en route. Because if you I don't know if you remember, shops used to have big stores at the back.
Yes.
Now they don't. They have the stuff that comes in one night, has to be sold the next night and moves out. So we've seen a real revolution in the nature of our food system and how it's stocked and how it's run.
Okay, are there any more questions from anybody from the floor? Anybody like to ask a question that hasn't been touched on? We've covered quite a wide range of topics.
I have a question for Joseph on Merseyside. Where are you? I grew up on Merseyside.
Is he here still?
I can see him at the bottom of my screen.
Oh, okay.
Well, yes, I no, I did. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I was in Leeds at one time for a period, but I'm actually Wallasey. If you could see
the Mersey Wall, as we called it.
Yeah, that's it. On the right, one of us is on the right side, and if you could see out of that window, you could just about see Wales. You can look over the Wirral Peninsula to Flintshire from here.
Okay, know roughly where you are. Thanks.
It's great to be able to come in. I did go to one or two meetings many years ago, but it's great to be able to come in on Zoom.
Yes.
So.
Well, I'm glad you're able to join us. That's brilliant. Any other questions anybody wants to raise before we close? Because Geoff, you've been on the go for quite a while now.
Well, I just thank you all. As I said, you could have had hours of this, and I just hope I didn't kind of curtail too much. I wanted to give you material that you can follow up with if you have a particular interest in a particular area. And do explore both my website and the Food Systems Academy, because there's a lot of interesting talks on the Food Systems Academy. There's quite a lot of interesting interviews on the blog. Most recently with Dan Saladino, who's written this book, Eating to Extinction. He's the producer of the food programme on Radio 4. And I try to, if I can, get interviews with people and about what they're doing.
No, I could really recommend it. It's an excellent resource, Geoff. It's got some amazing clips and things on there. So thank you very much. I don't know if Tom is still there. Do you want to just put if people want to get involved in Feed Leeds, do you just want to put down an email address that people can?
Well, the best thing to do is just go to our website, which is feedleeds.org. Right. And then click on, and you'll see the minutes from the last week. We had a meeting yesterday. They'll be going up sometime in the next week, but you can see all the minutes from all the meetings. And if you just go to the contacts and click on the mailing list, then you'll get the email for the meetings which are on Zoom. Or if you want to ask us any questions, Rosie and Paul and I are all members of the committee. Then the contact there comes directly to me, and
Tom,
I'll pass it on to
you, now you've got Feed Leeds.
Yep.
Are you connected with others in Yorkshire? Many years, well, no, probably 20 years ago, I helped coordinate a thing called the Northern Food Network.
Yes.
Which tried to bring together people from across the north involved in different bits of the food system. They could be environmental health officers, they could be, I don't know, catering people, whatever, to actually look and the issues that face them here in the north. And that was something we just carried on kind of meeting to meeting, and somebody took the ball and said, we'll have the next meeting, we'll have the next meeting.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that you've got something really good going in Leeds. I assume there's stuff going in other places. Calderdale's got something in Halifax.
Yeah.
Trying to develop that into a more coherent network where people can exchange knowledge and experience, as well as decide sometimes to push for X or Y across councils or through government, would be a really good thing. Whether you'd need a bit of resource for that, I don't know, but it would be really interesting to see if you could, I don't know how that's developing, or if you could do something like that.
Well, yes, we've got the two organisations in Leeds. I mean, originally it was just Feed Leeds, but there was this kind of bit of tension between the people who are interested in this kind of strategic stuff and the people who just worried about the the white mold on their cabbages. So in the end, we separated the two out, and it's Foodwise Leeds is actually the Leeds Food Partnership. So we're members of the Sustainable Food Places network. And so through that and the various different initiatives, we are connected with all the other food partnerships. And there is a Yorkshire Food Group, which actually set up by Zero Carbon Yorkshire. It's not terribly active, but it's there when we need it. Because particularly we're having a big push on reaching out to farmers, which is really difficult to do. We know they're out there, we know they're worried, we know a lot of them want to really change how they do things, but they don't think locally. They don't think of coming to their nearest city. So we've got systems, and we know that talking to them makes sense to work regionally because they've got markets. They want to talk to Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield rather than just us. So in fact, we've got the next meeting is going to be just about that very subject. We have got a farmers group, but there's not many in it because short of getting on my bike and riding up all the dirt tracks and knocking on the front door, I don't know how to reach these people.
It's difficult. I know the farmer across the road from us who does various things, but she's very worried about what's going to happen post Brexit and to the upland farmers, and that they're probably going to be sacrificial lambs. She feels she does raise a lot of sheep. But,
there's going to be an awful lot of change. I mean, Elms is going to be interesting, but there's all the tree planting, there's all the flooding work. And we've got to get back to regenerative agriculture, and we've got to get into local food markets, so connecting the hinterland with the local city, but organic, but then organic tends to be high carbon if you're not careful. There's all sorts of interesting conundrums, and the expertise in one area is with the farmers, the expertise in the other areas is within the cities, and we've got to somehow short circuit that system at a local level. So we all know what to do, but actually physically making it happen. But I think there's been huge progress in the 10 years since we formed. Nothing like as much as we need, but I'm pretty optimistic. But we need more people to get involved. So if anybody's interested.
I suppose that's the positive note I'd lead on. Wherever I've been in the world, I've found people doing things themselves and trying to organise because they can't rely on the quote unquote leaders we've got to deal with it.
Thanks very much too, Tom, for your contribution. It's really good to hear, for you to give a little information about what's going on with Feed Leeds. Well, thank you very much, Geoff, for a really stimulating evening. And you've been you really worked hard answering all these questions in great depth. So thank you. We really appreciate that, and hope we can see you again in the future.
Thank you all. Thank you for staying. Good night.
So
Thank you very much.
Have a good, safe Christmas. Hopefully COVID-free, everyone.
Happy Christmas.
And